大家好
Hello, everyone.
欢迎回到萤火农场
Welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm.
我知道我上次答应过要多说日语
I know that last time I promised to speak more Japanese.
但我的问题是我非常傲慢
But my problem is that I have an enormous ego.
所以当然我想我说中文来炫耀一下
So I wanted to show off and speak Chinese insteed.
じゃあ迷惑にならないように日本語に戻ります
Okay, now I will switch back to Japanese to be less annoying.
それでHagakureの旅行を終えるつもりで
We're going to complete our tour of the Hagakure.
ヘルメットを着用してください
So please put your helmets on.
いやマジで
No, seriously.
かぶってよ
Put them on.
戦いで死ぬ覚悟をしなければなりません
We must be prepared to die in battle.
So today we're going to finish our tour of the Hagakure. If I recall correctly, last time we talked about Japanese, samurai, swords, and being polite. And, of course, a samurai's favorite subject, death. Since this is the Hagakure, we're going to have to talk about samurai culture, and as we saw last time, the samurai were Debbie Downers who always talked about death. So let's get the doom and gloom out of the way right out of the gate, and let's hear a little more about death and why we shouldn't worry so much about it.
Whether people be of high or low birth, rich or poor, old or young, enlightened or confused, they are all alike in that they will one day die. It is not that we don't know that we are going to die, but we grasp at straws. While knowing that we will die someday, we think that all the others will die before us, and that we will be the last to go. Death seems a long way off. Is this not shallow thinking? It is worthless. It is a joke inside a dream. It will not do to think in such a way and be negligent. Because death is always at one's door, one should make sufficient effort and act quickly.
Well, I think this is a very healthy attitude. I noticed that the Hagakure is trying to instill in the reader a sense of immediacy in the proper approach to life. Multiple times, the Hagakure says that things should be done quickly. Notice that they're always trying to eliminate gaps in action or time spent over contemplating things. They would say that the time for overthinking is before the crisis happens. And this focus on quickness and efficiency reflects a deep attitude that they have that life is a fight. And not just a fight, it's a short, brutal, unfair fight to the death. And so, yes, you have to live in the moment, but the work of the moment is to prepare for a grim future, an inevitable death. Now, this is very different from the Forrest Gump style of seeing life as a journey, that you're sort of a buoy or a fishing bob, gently following the stream or the ocean current to wherever life takes you. I do think that there is a bit of a contradiction here. There's something that the Hagakure is hinting at that we have to put two and two together ourselves. Because on the one hand, if you're always living your last day with no thought for tomorrow, you could see how you could become reckless and impulsive. And why bother with all the planning and the perseverance? Because life is short, right? And the minute that 51% of the population follows that path, then society begins to unravel and rot from the inside out. Based on current data, it looks like you can go for about 5 generations, max, once you cross the 51% boundary. Anyway, back to the Hagakure, getting back under those leaves, you can see how you can go too far the other way meaning, okay, you're not living for your last day. In fact, you're going around the world assuming that everyone's going to live to be 120 years old in decent health, and everyone pretends that they're going to find their person and life is a journey and not a fight. Although that might emotionally lay the groundwork for a hard-working, decent life, it's just a lie. Almost certainly, nobody listening to me is going to live to be 120. You're definitely not going to be in decent health. And statistically, most people don't find their person because the person they've built up in their mind statistically does not exist. So the problem with, I suppose, the more Forrest Gump view of life is that it's based on a lie. At the very least, the samurai way of life is based on an incontrovertible fact that we're all going to die. And we're all going to die in ways we'd prefer not to die. And at a time when we would choose another time to die. And I think that is the one fact that shatters the life is a journey image. Because it stretches the meaning of the word journey. Now, you know, I'm a word guy. I'm all about the meaning of words. So let's think about what a journey is. Let's go with a simple one. Let's say that my journey is just going to a local orchard. I start out from home, walk out my front door. I walk a few miles to a local orchard to watch the sunset through the trees on a hill that I really like. And then on the way back, I stop for some food before heading back home. Now, I'd call that a journey. That's a journey. It didn't even have to go exactly according to plan. Let's say I did step in a gopher hole and I broke my ankle on the way there. Or on the way back, I got hit by a truck and I died while trying to cross the road. We would say that, yes, that was a journey. It had an unfortunate end, but it's still a journey. And I think people interpret the pain of life that way. They say, well, that was a gopher hole that I stepped in by accident during my journey. But I think that stretching the word a little bit, let's make that journey a little more like life. So we are starting from home, but we're walking along that road to the orchard, just hoping to get there. And we've never even been to that orchard. We just read books, saw some movies, and heard some old people talk about how awesome it was at the top of that hill. And so when we were young, we just started walking toward it, all the while knowing the odds are we're not going to reach that orchard. And as we got there, we saw more and more people falling by the wayside, giving up, never getting there, or stepping in those gopher holes or getting hit by trucks. And so while we're walking toward this orchard we've never been, we know with 100% certainty that at some random point between our house and this orchard at the top of this mythical hill, there's some kind of psychotic sniper who just likes to shoot people. And we know that at any point on this quote-unquote journey, this psychotic sniper is going to turn your brain into a pink mist right out of left field. That sounds more like a high-concept action movie than a journey. So if you want to describe that as a journey, let's jazz it up. Let's be a little more descriptive and specific. It's a particular kind of extreme journey. It's more like a death march. And since we're supposed to be talking about Japanese history, go ahead and look up the Bataan Death March. I think it's kind of twisted that the United States and Japan can bond over the long list of their government's war crimes. Imperial Japan gives any other government a run for their money on the evil scale. And to this day, the Japanese government has not acknowledged even 10% of the atrocities committed in the final few decades of Imperial Japan's rule over Southeast Asia. And to this day, the Japanese are a bit ostracized and seen as, quote-unquote, the other among other East Asian cultures. If there's one thing that cultural Koreans, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Filipinos can agree on, it's that the Japanese are a dangerous and peculiar people who should definitely stay on their own islands and keep to themselves forever. We might like or buy some of their food, electronics, or cars, or anime, but that's about it. So moving on, while a samurai is on their death march that they call life, waiting for the psychotic sniper to end their journey at any given point, the Hagakure warns samurai that they should avoid certain things. And if you're like me, you're going to assume that these terrible, vulgar things that a samurai should avoid are probably normal, pleasant things that normal people in our time indulge in daily. So, let's see. What are the 3 terrible things that a samurai should avoid?
It is said that a samurai should avoid too much pride, sake, or luxury. There is no cause for anxiety when you are unhappy. But when you become a little elated, these 3 things become dangerous. Look at the human condition. It is unseemly for a person to become prideful and extravagant when things are going well. Therefore, it is better to have some unhappiness while one is still young. For if a person does not experience some bitterness, his disposition will not settle down. If a person becomes fatigued when he is unhappy, then he is useless.
I like this idea. I think it's true. I think there's something to be said about the exuberance of youth betraying a lack of understanding about the pain and suffering that everyone is in for in this life. And I do think it's a sad fact that the strongest and most reliable people that you meet often had to deal with something terrible at a young age. So I agree that adversity in youth reliably produces an extremely productive and empathic person in later life. Now, not always, but I think more often than not, it turns out to be a source of strength if the person survives the initial problem. Now, can you be productive and empathic without something terrible happening to you as a child? Yes, of course, but if you were going to be productive and empathic regardless, and then something terrible happens to you, congratulations. Now you're going to be even more productive and empathic later in life. And notice again, the focus of the entire book and the samurai class, and to some extent feudal Japan in a larger context, was entirely focused on strength, endurance, productivity, and not fulfillment or truth or anything like that. In fact, as we'll see later on, these crystal clear concepts of truth and ironclad, unyielding codes of righteousness are not something that samurai should engage in. Okay, so at some point we're going to have to talk a little bit about the basics of the Japanese language. And I thought carefully about how to best get across some of the interesting things about the Japanese language without drowning people in grammar and topics that I enjoy quite a bit, but I've found that other people have a limited tolerance for. It's not complicated. This stuff doesn't require brain power. What it requires is just a bizarre personality that likes to immerse itself in this for years and years. So Bruce Wayne used his wealth and ambition to fight crime. I used my meager resources and my ambition to study foreign languages, including a lot of dead ones. Unfortunately, thanks to the birth rate crisis, Japanese might be a dead language in 100 years. It's a strange idea, but one we'll have to come to grips with as it becomes a reality over the next several decades. So let's start off with something easy. Let's say that someone has just asked you whether you have any money in Japanese. So how do you say, I don't have any money in Japanese? Well, it depends completely on the context. First off, using pronouns is generally rude in Japanese. You avoid it. So we know right off the bat, we're not going to say I or me or anything like that unless we absolutely have to. Plus, once you have to say I or you, especially, you have to decide on a pronoun to use. And there are several words in Japanese for I, depending on how you see yourself, how you want the other person to see you, what your social class is in the context of the conversation. And in general, a refined person will find a way to avoid referring to anyone directly. So there is a word for he, but you generally don't use it. And if a woman uses the word for he to talk about somebody, you kind of assume that that's their boyfriend or husband, because it implies a kind of brute intimacy that a person would not want to imply otherwise. So let's focus on the Japanese word for money, kane, kane. So it's nicer to add the honorific prefix o in front of it. So you would say okane, okane. That o prefix sometimes is go also. For example, if you talk about your family, you say kazoku, kazoku. But to refer to someone else's family, you have to say go kazoku, go kazoku. That's a great way to avoid using you, because instead of your family, you just say go kazoku. That would have to refer to someone else's family, not yours. And so in Japanese, you end up, once again, figuring out things from context as you're listening. The Japanese verb for owning something or having it in this context would be aru, aru. Kind of like ARU, but with the unusual Japanese R, and the Japanese U is very short. What does aru mean? Could mean I have, you have, there is. In some cases, there will be, he will have. So there's a lot of meaning in that little aru. And so I have money wouldn't be aru okane. You have to say it backwards, because in Japanese, subject comes first, then the object and other information, indirect object, that sort of thing. But then the verb comes last. Probably one of the strangest ironclad rules about Japanese is that the verb of a clause or a sentence comes at the end. And then there are some emotional tags, as I call them, exclamatory particles. There are different terms for them, but they go at the end after the verb, and they just sort of add emotional context to what's being said. So in other words, aru would have to go last. A very strange, crude, but understandable way to say I have money in Japanese would be okane aru. Okane aru. Now, the problem there is that a Japanese speaker is going to expect something between okane and aru. And that is a marker that tells them what the subject or topic of the sentence is. And there are a few of these. The primary one, well, there's two primary ones. There's wa and ga. Wa and ga. And it's similar to how it's tricky to know when to use the in English and when not to use the. It's almost like I kind of think of ga as more like the and wa more of a generic one. So if you were to say okane wa aru, that kind of means like you're just now bringing up the subject of money. Kind of like saying, well, speaking of money, I've got some. Okane wa aru. That's something you want your rich friend to say every now and then. If you're wondering, who's going to pay for the drinks? And if he says, okane wa aru, you're like, oh, hey, he's got money. Now, someone has already just asked you about money in this scenario, and you're telling them that you don't have any. So, because money has already been brought up, you can't use wa. You would say ga. So, okane ga aru would be, I have money. If the person was of a higher social status, or if you didn't know them very well, you were out in public, that sort of thing, you would say, okane ga arimasu. Arimasu. That is the polite way of saying have. Now, how do you say I don't have money? Well, long story short, you change the aru to nai. Or if you want to be super polite, you could change it to dewa arimasen. So, okane ga nai. Okane ga nai. I don't have money. Now, what are these emotional tags I'm talking about? A native Japanese speaker would feel strange just ending with a nai, even if they're with friends, especially since you're explaining that you don't have something you were asked for. There would be a sense of explanation needed. And it's just a weird thing that you pick up on when you listen to a lot of spoken Japanese. And so you would really expect something like, okane ga nai no, okane ga nai no. That no at the end is sort of, but it's just that I don't have any money. Or the explanation is, I don't have any money. Or here's the deal, I don't have any money. That no covers all of that. It's nice. And if you're really sad or upset about not having money, you add a ni at the end. Okane ga nai no ni. I'm just broke. For example, the way to say shut up in Japanese is urusai. Urusai. Now, urusai is not a command. It just is it's an adjective. It's just a statement. Someone is being loud. Rudely loud. Someone is being disruptive or noisy. So it could mean you're being noisy, I am being noisy, that sort of thing. But just like with the money, you can tell who it's being directed to by that ending particle. So if you were at a restaurant sitting with someone and the large table close to you was making a lot of noise and making conversation difficult, one of you could look at the other one and say, urusai ne. And that ne means, aren't they? Isn't that true? Do you agree? It's a little stronger than that. English people start to use it as, isn't it? But then they start to notice that the Japanese use it a lot. It's almost to the point where in a polite conversation, you want to make sure that no one thinks that you're giving them the rundown or you're telling them what's what. You would add ne to the end of any factual statement that the other person might know or would be expected to know, or might be insulted if you assumed that they didn't know it. So, sora ga aoi, the sky is blue. Sora ga aoi ne, it's blue, right? Or it's blue, we all know that. If you said okane ga nai ne, hey, we all know I don't have money. I don't have money, do I? So you can see how these little tiny syllables at the end of Japanese sentences can give you a lot of information, and sometimes it's the clue to figuring out what the heck they were saying because nobody is using any pronouns. And the verbs, as we saw, are not like Spanish where you can look at the ending of the verb and get a hint as to who's doing it. No such luck in Japanese. I don't know about you, but I keep hearing this word useless to refer to people in particular. Now, there's no point in getting into the exact pronunciation of the word that's being used in this source because Japanese has changed a lot since the early 1700s. And we're no stranger to that. If we think about Shakespeare's work from the early 1600s, we can get a sense of how different English was. And so we can think of the Japanese of the Hagakure in a similar way. However, the words are still being used, just with different modern pronunciations, both in Chinese and Japanese. The words for useless that are being used derive from Chinese. One of them simply just means having no use. It's just two Chinese characters, one meaning without, or not having, or in the absence of, and then the other character means usefulness, convenience, purpose. So it's not good to be that in the Hagakure, although there's an even worse one. The more insulting version is two Chinese characters. One is for wood. It's the character for a tree. And then the other one means a doll or a puppet, a marionette, a dummy, literally D-U-M-M-Y, like a crash test dummy. Now, wood in Chinese is mu, mu. And then this doll or puppet character is o. So muo, muo. That's the Chinese word. Now, the modern Japanese pronunciation of those two characters would be mokugu, mokugu, moku, is wood in Japanese. So mokugu is a wooden doll, a dummy, literally. A nicer word for doll, a wooden doll, in Chinese is murenxiang, which in Japanese would be mokujinzo. I think you're starting to hear how different these languages are. They don't sound anything alike. But when they write stuff down, they will very often use the same complicated characters. And they usually mean roughly the same thing, but just bear in mind that these two cultures have been using them quite independently for hundreds of years. They've developed on their own paths since the characters crossed over into Japan throughout the Middle Ages. Now, even this nicer word for doll wouldn't be suitable for a samurai to use to criticize someone. That would be very lower class of them. And so, what happens if a friend of a samurai does something terrible? How does a samurai deal with friends who've done something wrong? Are they punished like everyone else? Let's see.
When intimate friends, allies, or people who are indebted to you have done some wrong, you should secretly reprimand them and intervene between them and society in a good manner. You should erase a person's bad reputation and praise him as a matchless ally and one man in 1,000. If you will thus reprimand a person in private and with good understanding, his blemish will heal and he will become good. If you praise a person, people's hearts will change and an ill reputation will go away by itself. It is important to have the single purpose of handling all things with compassion and doing things well.
I find this surprisingly indulgent and almost nice for a culture that is so hell-bent on embracing the brutal realities of life. So why the constant concern about friendship and bitterness and not being overly mean to people? I wonder if they're onto something that we missed. And that is, when you're always focused on economic necessity and hardship, maybe you end up having no choice but to focus on the people around you because that's the community. That's what's going to live on after you. If your primary concern with yourself was simply your skill in administration or fighting and having a perfect set of armor to die in so that your enemy looks upon you with respect because of your discipline, well, then you're not going to be very focused on your own enjoyment and on what you can accomplish for yourself in your life. What's the point? The whole time you're training yourself to die for a community, for a family, for a clan, for your organization. And to be able to do that well requires a lot of strength, a lot of perseverance. And one really great source of strength and perseverance that we don't see much of now is hope for the future. When you're focused on how great your organization is going to be next year, how great your community is going to be 5 years from now, how great your family is going to be that you're going to start someday, that can help you get up in the morning. That can help you find the energy you need. And it's strange because I think it's all a big feedback loop. So when you start with this harsh self-discipline, you start to think to yourself at some point, why? Why would I discipline myself like that? Why would I deprive myself of sake and comfort? Why would I spend all this time training myself, building up all this skill, but then avoiding pride? Why would I limit my future wealth by having children? Why would I die fighting a foreign invader who's trying to take power from the brutal warlord who has power over me? If I'm carrying a 3-foot straight razor and no one can fight me, why not steal? Why not go to the market and extort a local vendor for my favorite fruit? If my government is going to dissolve into chaos any day now, and if no one cares about the common good, why bother with anything? So I think that, in a surprising way, this selfless discipline, this grim reality, this strict focus of staring death in the face is how you motivate yourself to bridge that gap. In other words, you have to find a way to motivate yourself. So it's really not just the strength of doing it. No one can really do that day in and day out. This is an unnatural way of thinking and living. It's a strict mental and emotional discipline. But I think it has some positive effects over time. What we also heard there was some echoes of what happened to Buddhism when it was imported into Japan. Zen is a big part of that story. And we're going to do, of course, some episodes on Zen Buddhism. I think it's fascinating. It's certainly the most militant form of Buddhism. There are often people who say that fascism and Buddhism could never go together. But Imperial Japan gave it a good go. They tried. Gotta hand it to them. So in the next clip, we're going to go back to dealing with social situations, in particular, how to meet new people, and how to deal with difficult people on occasion. I would just pull out my katana, but apparently that's bad form, so let's see what you're supposed to do.
The following was an opinion given by a priest concerning personal encounters. Meeting with people should be a matter of quickly grasping their temperament and reacting appropriately to this person and that. Especially with an extremely argumentative person. After yielding considerably, one should argue him down with superior logic, but without sounding harsh, and in a fashion that will allow no resentment to be left afterwards. This is a function of both your heart and your words.
I also think it's charming to think of these gruff, hardened samurai men with their top knots and their complicated clothing, sitting there struggling in their dealings with other people due to their difficulty in engaging their heart along with their words. I think the Hagakure is, to some extent, encouraging for me. It's a hopeful book. I think the Hagakure is an encouraging book because in this we can see humans successfully, to some extent, transforming chaos into order, transforming human violence and ambition into discipline and stability. They were obsessed with trying to bridge that gap. And I think it's helpful when a culture tries to help people understand and channel their feelings, their true feelings, the feelings that they were born with, and culture helps them know what to do with those feelings. Our culture doesn't do that. Our culture is sort of like, yeah, your feelings might be biological, they might just be, predictive programming or disinformation, but in any case, you're on your own, and I'm older than you, so I don't really have the right to tell you what to do with your life. And that's what insane societies sound like. What we see in the Hagakure is Bushido was trying to tame human nature into something that was still very ferocious, but also contained and useful for a society that wants to persist and be ordered and fruitful. And so learning how to lay siege to castles or perfecting your horseback archery wasn't the only thing a samurai should concern himself with. A big part was how to rule over the land that you control. And a big part of ruling is good leadership. And a big part of leadership is good constructive interactions with people, especially when they have differing opinions or just conflicting motivations. So here, the Hagakure, again, gives us more information about how to take and receive criticism and how to explore and understand other people's opinions. Let's hear.
When someone is giving you his opinion, you should receive it with deep gratitude, even if it is worthless. If you don't, he will not tell you the things that he has seen and heard about you again. It is best to give and receive opinions in a friendly way.
Well, that was just downright sweet. I suppose it would always be a good idea to receive opinions in a friendly way when every man in the room is wearing a 3-foot straight razor. But here's my problem. This does not sound much like the typical cinematic portrayal of a samurai. I don't recall them being nurturing and kind and understanding like that. I can think of one incident that might be applicable or similar to this situation from a movie called Ran. Ran. R-A-N. It's the Japanese word, based on a Chinese word, of course, for chaos or disorder. So that's the name of the movie, Chaos or Disorder. It was made in 1985. So, spoiler alert, if you want to be surprised by the resolution of this one part of a story of a multi-layered 3-hour epic set in feudal Japan, shot in very old-fashioned Technicolor, then be warned. Skip ahead if you're dying to go through that experience. If not, just bear with me. To fast forward us up to the ending, Lord Hidetora turned 70 years old. He turned 70 years old and he decided to retire. And he wanted to retire and divide his kingdom and his 3 castles between his 3 sons. And this should have been simple and awesome, a great triumph of family, brotherhood, and awesomeness. But as you might suspect, the greed, pride, and bloodlust of the father and 2 of the brothers ruins everything. And of course, by the last reel of the movie, one brother is dead, another brother is exiled, but trying to return home. And of course, the exiled brother is the only decent and honest one. And of course, at the end, the only surviving brother is the worst one of all, Lord Taro. Lord Taro's lust for his brother's wife, Lady Kaede, had blinded him to the fact that she was actively plotting to destroy his family and have them all killed in revenge for what their father, Lord Hidetora, had done to her family when she was a child. She could definitely hold a grudge. I'll give her that. So after the eldest brother was murdered, Lady Kaede wanted to seduce Taro, but the problem was Lord Taro was already married to Lady Sue. So, of course, Lady Kaede orders Lord Taro's lead samurai, Master Kurogane, to kill Lady Sue. Now, Master Kurogane, he's a real one. He's awesome. I mean, of course he is. His name in Japanese means black metal, and that's awesome. It's a reference to raw iron. So, in good form, Master Kurogane accepts the mission, and a bit later in the film, we see Kurogane appearing in court before Lord Taro and Lady Kaede, and he's holding a box, and he gives the box to Lady Kaede. Now, he's been ordered to kill Lord Taro's wife, Lady Sue. So, a full decade before the movie 7, the audience was asking, "What's in the box?" Of course, this was in Japan, so instead of "What's in the box," they'd ask, "Hako no naka ni wa nani ga aru no?" So, and note there, the question ended with no. That's one way to ask a question where you were asking for an explanation. It's a similar use of no, like we talked about earlier. So if you hear a question ending in no, then you know that that's not really a yes or no question. They're not expecting a quick answer. They kind of really want to know what you think. If ka is at the end of a question, they might be just asking you a real basic yes or no question. They're not asking for a lot of explanation. Then there's kai, which I've heard It's a kind of a rude way to end a question, and it's pretty much just asking for yes or no. I don't really want to hear what else you have to say. It's that kind of thing. So once again, you see how intuitive and emotionally complex Japanese can be. So Lady Kaede gets excited, and she opens the box, eager to see Lady Sue's decapitated head inside. But to her dismay and disappointment, it's just a stone head of a sculpture of a fox. So Lady Kaede explodes into anger and demands that Kurogane explain himself. So Master Kurogane falls on his knees and touches his forehead to the tatami mat before Lord Taro and begs his forgiveness. And he says, "I regret that I must be the one to inform you that your former wife, Lady Sue, was a fox spirit in human disguise. I have heard of this occurring in China. A fox spirit takes the form of a human, but when it dies, it returns to a stone form of its true self." He then warns Lord Taro to be careful of such spirits or demons in disguise in our midst. Now, when he says that there may be more demons in disguise in our midst, his head kind of moves a particular direction, kind of in the general direction of Lady Kaede. Now, Lord Taro is not very bright, but even he knows this is complete baloney, and Lord Taro gratefully assumes that Kurogane did what Kurogane actually did, which is to put Lady Sue in hiding, and then cook up this fox spirit story to allow his lord to save face among the courtiers, while not being guilty of murdering his wife. But this also allows Lord Taro to marry Lady Kaede, which is what the lord wants to do. So, Master Kurogane, being a good samurai, is not really trying to thwart the will of his lord, even though he thinks the lord is being a dummy. A mokugu. So, fast forward to the end of the movie. Lord Taro's castle is surrounded by his enemies, not his brothers. They're all dead. Lord Taro is so inept that despite becoming the head of his family, his army is now destroyed, and a coalition of enemy houses have all their samurai at the gates of his last castle, ready to break in any minute. This is when Kurogane finds out that Lady Kaede had succeeded in convincing another samurai, a much less honorable samurai, to kill Lady Sue. Kurogane finds out that Lady Sue was found and killed anyway, despite his efforts. And so, in the middle of the battle, what does Kurogane do? Does he go to Lady Kaede and reprimand her privately, as the Hagakure might suggest? Does he praise her publicly? He's known Lady Kaede for years, since she was a child, no doubt. Now, he never liked her. They never had anything more than the coldest public and professional relationship. Did he seek her opinion on the matter to gain wisdom? And most important, was he restrained and polite? Kurogane bursts into her chamber and demands that she explain herself. Lord Taro follows him, concerned about what Kurogane might do in his anger. Kurogane calls her a she-fox and a liar. Before everyone, Lady Kaede admits that her real goal was to end Taro's entire family, and that she was grateful now that she had seen her goal to the end, now that their last castle was about to be burned down and they were all about to die. Master Kurogane steps forward, and in one smooth motion, he unsheathes his katana and cuts Lady Kaede in half. They don't quite show her. She was sitting, so as he's standing, the camera follows him. But since she's a small person and sitting down, you don't see much of her at the moment when his sword swings down. But Kurosawa clearly had a gallon of pressurized Technicolor blood ready to go. I suppose the idea was that her aorta would have painted the entire wall behind her, and that's kind of how they did it. So, yeah, it's a brutal graphic movie. in terms of people dying in that movie, she's literally just one of thousands. So, Master Kurogane, after doing this, turns to Lord Taro and says, "This is the end, my lord. We must now face our death. I will follow right behind you." And so they go to the battle and they die. So that was a very decisive measure on Master Kurogane's part. That's very much like a samurai. It was a quick and final resolution. So from that perspective, Kurogane followed Bushido. So yes, it's a grim movie. There's a court jester, Hidetora's court jester, named Kyoami. He tells jokes and writes funny songs. And he says things like, "Man is born crying. When he has cried enough, he dies." So he's hilarious. At the end of the movie, Kyoami shakes his fist at the sky, and he says, "Are there no gods? Is there no Buddha? If you exist, listen to me. You are mischievous and cruel. Are you so bored up there that you must crush us like ants? Is it that much fun to see people cry?" And then another honorable samurai, Tango, he tells Kyoami to shut up when Kyoami is crying, is yelling at the gods and at Buddha. Tango ends the film with his words of truth. Tango says, "Enough! Do not blaspheme. It is the gods who weep. They see us killing each other over and over since time began. They weep because they cannot save us from ourselves." It sounds even better in Japanese. Feudal Japanese. Very uplifting and inspiring, I think. Really makes you want to get up in the morning and start your day. And you think to yourself, what am I going to do today that's going to make God cry? Now, leaving the world of cinematic 15th century samurai from movies made in the 1980s, and returning to the more boring, real-life, literary samurai of the 17th century. We're going to move away from cutting people in half to dealing with other people's opinions again, especially their opinions about the quality of your writing and your research. Let's hear.
Being superior to others is nothing more than having people talk about your affairs and then listening to their opinions. The common person settles for their own opinions and thus never excels. To have a discussion with a person is one step towards surpassing him. A certain person discussed with me the written materials at the clan office. He is better than someone like me in writing and researching. When you seek correction from others, you surpass them.
So this sounds a bit like a Steve Jobs type of samurai. Very ambitious, very interested in getting the organization part of things right. Obsessed with competence and efficiency. Steve Jobs used to say that I don't have to win in a meeting or in an argument. He said that the best idea has to win. Of course, the trick is, well, okay, how do we know which one is the best idea? And why does it always tend to be yours? Isn't it a coincidence that you tend to think your ideas are the right ones? And so you got to watch yourself and make sure that you're not just falling in love with your own ideas because you love where they come from. At the same time, you got to watch out for other opinions out there. I don't want to say something as ugly as there are a lot of stupid people out there. I won't say that. But I'll say definitely there are a lot of people who somehow have very stupid opinions about a lot of important things. And so that's two groups of people so far. The first one is yourself. The second one is the endless chorus of people on the periphery shouting out their opinions at you. But then there's a third group, and I think that's what the Hagakure wants us to focus on. There are smart people out there. There are wise people. and it's your job to find them and listen to them. If you go around never trusting your opinions, you're going to go off the rails. If you go around listening to every opinion that's shouted at you, you're going to go off the rails. So you got to find these people, because it's interesting. It's almost a numbers game. The people who are not wise are not very competent. They're not very good at getting done what they want to get done. But unfortunately, there's a lot of them. I think we tend to underestimate the power of sheer numbers, and also the shocking persistence of bad ideas. And speaking of the power of numbers and a small group of people who think they're smart, if you are one of these feudal lords living in your castle, you're going to have to worry about things like the treasury, or whether you can afford the oats for your war horses over the winter. And when you have your meetings and your war councils, maybe sometimes with delicately painted miniatures on a table, arranged on a perfectly painted map of a battlefield, and right when you're about to make some really smart, important point to your lackeys, some lower-class functionary barges in, and you're about to flip your helmet. There is steam filling up the space inside your helmet where your hair should be. And so what do? Do you freak out and cut somebody in half? I doubt they'll recommend that. Let's see.
When an official place is extremely busy, and someone comes in thoughtlessly with some business or other, often there are people who will treat him coldly and become angry. This is not good at all. At such times, the etiquette of a samurai is to calm himself and deal with the person in a good manner. To treat a person harshly is the way of middle-class lackeys.
Now here I think we see more than just advice about politeness. A good leader is not easily flustered. In the play Julius Caesar, Caesar says, "I am as constant as the northern star." It's true that a good leader seems immovable. They definitely can listen to others' opinions and adapt to changing conditions, but you don't want to see a leader fluttering in the wind of others' opinions, and definitely not fluttering in the wind of their own emotions. So, being calm when others are upset, or showing grace to someone that others are attacking, is the kind of thing you see leaders do. Now, just like we kept seeing the word useless, we're also seeing phrases like, "it will not do," or "that is not good at all." It's not acceptable. It just will not do. As you might expect, modern Japanese has a very convenient, short, frequently used word that means it's not good at all, it just will not do, it's not acceptable, it's not proper, a verbal pearl-clutching exclamation. And that word is dame, dame, kind of like D-A-M-E, dame. So if kore means this, and dame means not good, will not do, unacceptable, this will not do in Japanese would be kore wa dame yo, kore wa dame yo. This idea of something just not working, just not doing, this very abstract sense of what socially fits and what does not, it factors into how the Japanese language frames moral statements. In English and in Indo-European languages in general, you have a word that just means must or have to, something you got to do. And we use that to talk about what somebody ought to do or what's required for whatever reason. So in English, we would say, I go or I'm going, but then you can say I must go or I have to go. Now in Japanese, I go or I'm going is just iku, kind of like IKU. Then the more polite version is ikimasu. So how do you say I must go or I have to go instead of ikimasu? You would say ikanakereba narimasen. Ikanakereba narimasen. So ikanai would be I don't go. Ikanakereba is the Japanese construction that would mean if I do not go, or if somebody does not go. Naru is to become or to fit socially, to be what should happen. Narimasen is the polite negative. So you have to put the two together. Ikanakereba narimasen. I must go. Well, moving on. This next one is short, but it's one of my favorites. Let's listen.
If one has no earnest daily intention, and one does not consider what it is to be a warrior, even in his dreams, and he lives through the day idly, he can be said to be worthy of punishment.
Believe it or not, I agree with this. I think life is too short, too unique, too important for any young person to be idle. Playing, yes. Learning, definitely. Meditating, yeah. Contemplating life, sure. Those things are all admirable, to an extent, as long as the amount of play is proportional to the amount of work or learning, which I think is the primary work of a young person, is getting all that information and skill in their head, getting them up to speed so they can take the baton and run down the road with it. So these young people who have all this information and skill and nuance and networking and emotional connection to do, I think they should not be engaged in pure idleness. This reminds me of something Aristotle wrote, which is that all true learning is painful. In other words, if no suffering occurred, then no real learning occurred. And speaking of Aristotle, this next one also connects with Aristotle. I also really like this next one, and to a large extent, I live by it, and it has served me well. Aristotle argued that the good is, quote, that to which all actions aim, end quote. Aristotle didn't think that when a rational being commits murder, they did it because they decided not to do good. They just decided, I want to do evil that day. Rather, Aristotle sees that as a mistake where they thought that committing murder was a good thing in that particular instance. Aristotle saw people as trying to contextualize or rationalize their behavior rather than just saying, yeah, I was just evil, sure. But I'm good today. I don't know if I agree with Mr. Aristotle here. I'm not sure how much choice is involved at any given moment. Obviously, people make choices. We have choices. But exactly where do those choices come from? And how do we define good? Who gets to define what good is? That's the other issue. Sadly for everybody, I do plan to do some episodes on the kind of philosophy that I think is useful. Epistemology, deontology, branches of philosophy that involve meaning and purpose and morality. And we kind of are doing that now with the Hagakure. In fact, let's listen to, once again, a quote that I take to heart. And it is the samurai's definition of the highest good. What is the highest good for a samurai?
Master Ite once said, if one were to say what it is to do good in a single phrase, it would be to endure suffering. Not enduring is bad, without exception.
Now this reminds me a little bit of Conan the Barbarian, that awesome early 80s movie where someone asks Conan the Barbarian, famously played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, what is best in life, Conan? Conan, tell us, what is best in life. And as the camera dollies in on Arnold Schwarzenegger's face, you see Conan think and speak from the heart. And he says, "To crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of the women." This also reminds me of the Roman idea of patientia, which was perverted by French and entered English as patience. And we think of it as the ability to wait calmly, to be quiet and respectful while others do whatever they're doing. That's what we call patience. But the Latin word patientia comes from passio, suffering. And that's where passion, as in Passion of the Christ, comes from. Once again, that's another French perversion of a Latin word. Passion originally meant suffering. In the modern period, it became just, a strong feeling. Everything got watered down in the modern world. So the original patientia was the ability to suffer. Sound familiar? It captures some of the same idea as Master Ite's concept of enduring suffering being the highest good. Okay, now moving on to legal business. Samurai in the early days focused on swordsmanship and enduring suffering, as we just mentioned. But the samurai class, as it gentrified and fossilized into a more paper-pushing kind of job, they were often called to give testimony before lords and magistrates in court. And let's hear more about that.
Because of some business, Moroka Hikoeman was called upon to swear before the gods concerning the truth of a certain matter. But he said, "A samurai's word is harder than metal. Since I have impressed this fact upon myself, what more can the gods and Buddhas do?" And the swearing was cancelled. This happened when he was 26.
Now, once again, we are going to do a lot of episodes on Buddhism, and Buddhism in Japan, of course, where we will talk about Zen Buddhism. Japanese thought in the area of what we call religion is, as you might expect, very different. It's often said that Japan is a very atheist society today. I don't think that accurately describes the attitude. Japan, like China, had a ton of traditional animistic beliefs about local deities and demigods and types of magic and witchcraft, that sort of thing. And then that was layered over with their more philosophical traditions, like, say, in China, Taoism or even Confucianism, although that, as we'll see, is not really a religion. And then when Buddhism entered China and Japan, it had an enormous impact. However, I think a lot of people overestimate the influence of Buddhism on Chinese and Japanese culture. It never dominated in the same way that Christianity did in Europe up to the modern period. And as we all know, Japan has been very resistant to outside cultural influence in certain spiritual areas. Today, Japan is less than 2% Christian. However, if you go to Japan, you'll see an enormous amount of shrines and beautiful art and traditions and ceremonies and continuing genuine beliefs about the Japanese animist tradition. And so it's a complex story. Japan has always walked this strange tightrope where it's performing a balancing act between this sort of insular society that refuses to be influenced by the outside world, while at the same time importing an enormous amount of stuff, Buddhism from China. And because of the American relationship with Japan since World War II, English loanwords comprise about 20% of modern Japanese. Now, speaking of imports, in particular, cultural imports from China, this next one is pretty funny. Let's listen.
In China, There was once a man who liked pictures of dragons, and his clothing and furnishings were all designed accordingly. His deep affection for dragons was brought to the attention of the dragon god. And one day, a real dragon appeared before his window. It is said that he died of fright. He was probably a man who always spoke big words, but acted differently when facing the real thing.
This reminds me of something my grandfather always said. As you may recall, he was a veteran of World War II, and he used to say, "Let me tell you something. If someone is shooting at you, trying to kill you, and you're not scared, then you're not brave. You're just a damn fool." So my grandfather taught me that bravery is about what you do when you're scared. And so I think that previous story was about someone who maybe thought that fear was something that you could control. But maybe he should have seen that part of why he liked dragons was how they did inspire fear. And could he handle that level of fear in real life? Well, we found out. Almost like the person who's the biggest fan of horror movies is also the person who freaks out the most when they hear something outside their window. So in the next clip, the Hagakure starts to talk about a higher morality than righteousness, and it refers to this quote-unquote way. And that might sound familiar. We talked about the Chinese word Dao, which meant a way or a path, and how that word entered Japan. And the original word for karate was karate do, and that do in Japanese, like bushido, comes from the Chinese word Dao. Now remember, in Chinese, Dao is a path or a way. Now, Dao is a sword, completely different word. Kind of like Shu is a book in Chinese, but Shu is one word for a tree. And then xie means to write something, where xie is a shoe, xie is gratitude, and it's part of the word for thank you in Chinese. Xie xie. And so some of you may have heard about the Chinese tradition called Taoism, and it is pronounced Taoism. But unlike Nietzsche, who waited for a Superman to come along and give us a new kind of morality that will bring us to some higher place, this way that the Hagakure is talking about is something that can be found by ordinary people through discussion and contemplation, as we'll see. When he's talking about going beyond mere righteousness, it's not the sort of amoral, ugly thing that Nietzsche was talking about. I think it's a more interpersonal and community-based approach to finding out the right thing to do. So, let's hear.
To hate injustice and stand on righteousness with perseverance is a difficult thing. Furthermore, to think that being righteous is the best one can do, and to value righteousness exclusively, will bring many mistakes. There is a way beyond righteousness. This is very difficult to discover, but it is the highest wisdom. When seen from this standpoint, things like righteousness are rather shallow. If one does not understand this on his own, it cannot be known. There is a method of getting to this way, however. Even if one cannot discover it by himself, this is found in consultation with others. Even a person who has not been able to discover it can learn from his neighbors. It is like the saying from the game of Go. He who sees from the side has 8 eyes. And the saying, thought by thought, we see our own mistakes, also means that the highest way is in discussion with others. To learn from listening to the old stories and from reading books implies throwing away one's own discrimination and attaching oneself to that of the ancients.
I think it's interesting here that he warns people against giving up their own discrimination and just substituting that of the ancients for it. It seems like they're saying that you should always use input from the ancients as valuable consultation and information, but you can't just blindly do what they would have done in their time. And I don't think he's talking about moral relativism, where later generations find out how evil their grandparents were and suddenly change the rules. I think he's talking about the old bread and butter conflicts of moral philosophy, like the trolley problem, the situations where nature forces you to prioritize one life over another. There's 4 people on the plane, but only 1 parachute. So we know for a fact 3 people are going to die, only 1 gets to survive. Who's that going to be? Now that is where moral philosophy becomes the star of the show. Now here in the Hagakure, you can see how heavily social this society is. And of course, modern Japan is not nearly the intense pressure cooker that feudal Japan was. Definitely more intensely social than our society. But here in this passage, you can see the concerns about social status, acknowledging experts, and always subjugating one's will to the family or to the community. I think we saw some of this anti-individualistic quality in ancient Germanic cultures, and for similar reasons. I think both cultures were basically constructed by cultural evolution to be a peak culture for total warfare. So these tiny, fertile, volcanic islands in Japan with the great farmland and fisheries was a petri dish for developing a very warlike culture, just like Central Asia of 3,000 years ago. Now, from what I understand, Chinese culture has always been more legalistic and top-down in a sort of harshly vertical pyramid, much more similar to Near East societies like Bronze Age Egypt or Sumeria, where what we had in Japan was much more modular and fragmented. It was a complex tapestry of relations and allegiances, where constant oaths and kinship and blood feuds ruled the day. You can see the similarity with medieval Europe. And that's where the word feudal comes in, because feudal refers to the political system where warlords and their clans or houses or tribes wield power, and this power is hereditary, absolute, enforced through violence on a farming peasantry. And this giant, messy, jangly pyramid scheme extortion racket was glued together by an elite warrior class that serves the nobility, and they are highly rewarded for doing so. And a whole cult of admiration develops around them. In Western Europe, we have the knights, and in Japan, we have the samurai. And so feudal Japan was, like Western Europe, this constant ebb and flow of one clan versus another in a Game of Thrones type cycle. And just like in some of the episodes of Game of Thrones, these rulers had to have their meetings to review their economic policies and the big ledger book of the kingdom. They needed to know who owed money to who for mercenaries or sewage cleanup. Here's a story about one of those meetings and what the samurai thought about their management over the common people.
When a certain person was saying that present matters of economy should be detailed, someone replied that this is not good at all. It is a fact that fish will not live where the water is too clear. But if there is duckweed or something like that, the fish will hide under its shadow and thrive. Thus, the lower classes will live in tranquility. If certain matters are a bit overlooked or left unheard, this fact should be understood with regard to people's conduct.
Wow. Okay, so a little bit to unpack there. This reminds me of a Roman legal doctrine that became our legal doctrine. The Latin was lex non curat de minimis. The law doesn't concern itself with trifles. Or the law does not care about the smallest of things. That's one way to translate it. This also applies to the British Commonwealth countries like Australia or Canada, and of course the UK itself. In this last quote, we can see that this is a society where the classes keep to themselves. The samurai were often the judges. The lords of the castle had the power of life and death over the people inside it. And, as we've seen, this power over life and death was central to the samurai approach to life. This attitude about death was the bedrock of their morality. Their preparation for death and their insistence on a noble death was how they derived their motivation and their values. So they did it for a purpose. This becoming as if one were already dead, strangely, brings a lot of rewards in life. So let's listen.
I have come to understand that the way of the samurai is that of dying. When a warrior comes to a life or death situation, there is for him only the quick choice of death. There are no other details. Be determined and advance. To say that dying without reaching one's aim is to die in vain is a frivolity of a wimpish samurai. When pressed with the choice of life or death, it is no longer necessary to gain one's aim. We all want to live, and in large part, we reason our way into clinging to life. Now, not pursuing our aim and continuing to live, that is cowardice. This is a fine and dangerous line. If you sacrifice everything to obtain your goal and die short of fulfilling it, you have nothing to be ashamed of. This is the essence of the way of the samurai. You must die anew every morning and every night. If you continually preserve the state of death in everyday life, you will understand the essence of Bushido, and you will gain freedom in the way. Your whole life will be without blame, and you will succeed in your calling.
I'm starting to suspect that a person's moral sense is always tailored to their ideas about death. I think that a person's approach toward their own death informs how they treat other people. I think that the more we contemplate our own death, in other words, how temporary we are forced to keep seeing ourselves as part of something larger, or something that will continue when we're gone. And I don't think this is unique to Japan. I think it's a human universal. The Stoic tradition in Rome did not have a clear view of the afterlife. And in the movie Gladiator, Maximus, although Maximus did believe in Elysium and believed he would meet his family in the afterlife, There were a lot of people around him who did not believe in Elysium, like his boss, Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic and believed that the universe was a giant machine and was essentially material in nature. So Maximus, still speaking to his mostly Stoic fellow cavalrymen, gave them a pep talk at the beginning of the movie where he says, "Remember, brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity." The important thing there is that he was reminding the cavalrymen that they were not going to be riding into eternity. Only the actions they take in this short life will continue into eternity. And the Romans had a saying, memento mori, which one way to translate it is, remember that you will die. Keep your own mortality in mind. Now, why would you do that? I think it's all for the same reason. Notice that in this speech and in the Hagakure, the person might disappear forever. There's no comment here about how long the soul will live, or whether people are entirely material or not. And notice it doesn't matter, because whether or not your soul is real, your community is real, your reputation is real, your children are real. If you're a boat builder, the boats you build are real. They'll survive you. Maybe the company that builds the boats will survive you. And generations of your family will become associated with great nautical engineering. I think that is the purpose behind all of this memento mori stuff. I think it does cause a certain kind of pro-social disciplined behavior in a society. Do we live in that kind of society? Absolutely not. I think we're all raised to do the exact opposite. We're taught to either avoid thinking about death altogether, or when we do think about it, think about the awesome place we're going after we die. I'm not saying that we're not going anywhere after we die. I think about the movie Forrest Gump, which I think is very representative of our culture's attitudes toward life. Famously, he said that life is like a box of chocolates and you don't know what you're going to get. So the idea is just dive in, try the chocolate, and enjoy life however you can. The problem there is that way of life leaves everyone disappointed and with type 2 diabetes. Life is not a box of chocolates. It is if you're a confused young person. Of course you don't know what you're going to get. Clearly you didn't do any research. You don't know where the chocolate came from. I mean, isn't there a diagram on the lid of the box? And if there isn't, if there's no way to know what you're biting into, don't bite into it. Nobody says you have to sit there and eat chocolate. And so if you're one of these confused people tackling life as if you're the first person and not the 40 billionth person to experience the human condition, well then, yes, your life is a mystery box. But the life of a community is not like a box of chocolates. The life of a community is like an awesome buffet that serves all the standards at a high level. Prime rib, waffles, fresh fruit, yes, chocolate, but they're all labeled. We know what's in the chocolates. You also got mashed potatoes, carrots, all the stuff you want, everything you expect. And sure, here's the problem. To have that predictable buffet day in and day out, you have to have other people, lots of them. They have to be skilled people. They all have to understand social rules. They all have to exercise self-discipline. You have to punish selfishness among them. So as you can see, our current view of society is not all of us sitting in a big room enjoying an awesome buffet together. Instead, we're all hidden away in corners by ourselves, stuffing ourselves with our state-issued boxes of mystery chocolate. So yeah, life is quite different for us. But the Hagakure gives us a glimpse of life that's not like that. It tells us maybe we don't have to be stuffing chocolate into our face by ourselves, anxious and alone. But maybe there's a price that we don't want to pay. I think the Hagakure hints at what that price is. The price of a good life, the price of the community buffet, the price of not fearing death is to give up on the self, to give up on happiness, to give up on freedom, to give up completely on that little lump of flesh that you are that's just going to leave the earth fairly soon. You're putting all your eggs in a basket that's guaranteed to fail. It's healthier to focus on the things that will outlive you. Your community, your life's work, your book, your children, the buildings you designed. If you keep thinking about death and you develop a continual awareness that you're going to drop dead at some random moment, you can choose to say, well, I'm just going to get mine while I can. I'm going to leave an attractive looking corpse. I'm going to get rich. I'm going to have my fun. The problem there is that is a very stressful and exhausting kind of life. You can do that for a little while, especially when you're very young, but you'll crack soon because part of your brain is watching the clock. And I think as we go through life, our brains become keenly aware of all the little clues that we're not going to make it. This is a long movie, and our character is not in the last scene. We might just be an extra, unfortunately. And so you don't spend all your budget on the extras. You don't put all your hopes and fears into yourself or previous generations because they're good as gone. You got to look at the next generation. And I think that's where a lot of this energy about training up the young comes from. We see that in the Hagakure. They're obsessed with young people having intention to make something of themselves and to develop skill. Now to, strangely at this point, go back to the Bible, Paul the Apostle talked about the good fight. And he used the word kalos there for the fight. You could also say the noble struggle. In one passage, he talked about how at the end of one's life, it's good to say, I finished the race, I fought the good fight. And so the question for everyone is, what's your good fight? At your funeral, are people going to say you fought the good fight? What did you fight? Did you have one? Do you want one? I think humans are designed to fight. Sure, statistically, if you have a Y chromosome, you are better designed for physical combat, especially in terms of upper body strength and red blood cell count. But bad news for everybody. Got bad news for everyone. All humans were designed to suffer and fight. All humans were designed to work their entire life. Now, gender roles did define what jobs you did and who you fought and when and how you could fight. But all of our ancestors had their fights, had struggles to suffer through. I think humans lose their mind without conflict. I think peace triggers some of our worst instincts. And I think conflict triggers something in us that we would call attention to real life, or at least the shocking fragility of life, and our surprising strength when it comes to conflict. I think we're all much weaker than we think in some ways, and we're all much stronger than we think in other ways. So until next time, remember, making peace with death is the key to strength and freedom, but that's hard. I still haven't done it. Look, I just read this book, this old Japanese book, and it's gotten me thinking. And so now I'm overthinking it to you. And all I can see is that it looks like I've got some things I've got to let go. Namely, myself. I got to stop clinging to this sad lump of meat that's only has a few decades left at most, and pay attention to all the stuff that's going to be here when I go. And that's where I'll find peace. You find peace in the good fight. A peaceful life is spent fighting a brutal, short, unfair fight to the death that we call life. So, until next time, memento mori.